Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back over 5,000 years to ancient Egypt, where the air is thick with desert heat and the sweet scent of fermenting grain. You're standing beside the Nile River, watching barefoot brewers stir massive vats of what will become the most important beverage in the entire kingdom. The sun beats down mercilessly on your unprotected skin. Without modern sunscreen, you'd probably develop a blistering sunburn that would make tomorrow's existence truly miserable, if not eventually fatal from skin cancer. But don't worry about that now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of Egyptian beer begins around 3400 BCE, when the mysterious process of fermentation was first harnessed in the fertile Nile Valley. This isn't your modern craft IPA. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and slightly sweet, more like a soupy porridge than the clear amber liquid you might be picturing. They called it HQT, roughly pronounced Heket, and it was absolutely fundamental to Egyptian society, consumed by everyone from pharaohs to the humblest laborers. You're watching now as workers soak specially prepared loaves of bread in water, allowing the natural yeasts to transform simple grains into something magical. The brewing process is laborious, but respected. These aren't just brewers, they're practitioners of a divine craft, as beer was considered a gift from the god Osiris himself. What makes this ancient beer so fundamentally important was its role as both nourishment and payment. Workers constructing the pyramids received a daily ration of several liters of beer as part of their compensation. Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian consumed between 1 and 4 liters of beer daily. But either way, that's a lot of brewing. The funny thing about Egyptian beer, if you tried it today, you'd probably spit it right out. It had to be sipped through a straw to filter out the floating bits of grain and herbs. Imagine explaining to an ancient Egyptian that one day people would pay extra for unfiltered beer when they spent thousands of years trying to solve exactly that problem. As you observe the bustling brewery, you notice something curious. The entire operation is crawling with cats. They slink between clay vessels, perch atop grain storage bins, and patrol the perimeter with alert eyes and twitching tails. These aren't just pets or random strays, they're integral to the brewing operation, with a specific and crucial role to play. And their relationship with Egyptian beer production would change the course of feline history forever. But to understand why cats became the unsung heroes of ancient brewing, we need to examine the critical problem that threatened Egypt's precious beer supply. A tiny but devastating menace that could destroy an entire season's worth of brewing grain in a matter of weeks. You're standing in a vast Egyptian grain storehouse, watching as workers carefully measure out the day's barley and emmer wheat allocations. The air is dusty, filled with the earthy scent of dried grain. These storehouses are the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization. Without these carefully maintained reserves, the entire kingdom would collapse within months. The Egyptians had perfected agriculture along the fertile banks of the Nile, creating one of the ancient world's first food surpluses. This excess grain wasn't just for emergency rations. It formed the foundation of their entire economy and was the primary ingredient in their beloved beer. But this precious commodity faced a relentless enemy that threatened everything: rodents. As darkness falls, you watch the grain storehouse transform into a battleground. Mice and rats emerge from tiny crevices, scurrying across the floors and climbing storage containers with remarkable agility. A single pair of mice can produce up to 150 offspring in a year, and each rodent destroys far more grain than it consumes, contaminating entire stockpiles with droppings and urine. Egyptians tried everything to protect their precious grain. You observe workers constructing elevated storage platforms with smooth sides, making them difficult for rodents to climb. Others apply noxious substances around the perimeter, mixtures of ash, herbs, and minerals that might deter the invaders. One particularly dedicated fellow is reciting what appears to be a rodent-repelling spell from the Book of the Dead. Spoiler alert, it's not working particularly well. The grain problem wasn't just about quantity, it was about quality too. Egyptians had discovered that the best beer came from the best grain, properly stored and protected from moisture, mold, and yes, rodent contamination. Royal breweries demanded the highest quality ingredients, adding even more pressure to solve the rodent problem. Here's a tidbit that modern brewers might appreciate. Ancient Egyptian storehouse managers could allegedly identify over a dozen different types of grain damage and determine whether affected grain could still be used for brewing or should be relegated to less prestigious uses. Imagine being the poor apprentice who had to memorize all those categories of grain damage. You're watching now as a storehouse manager inspects the morning's losses. He shakes his head in frustration, knowing that the grain destroyed overnight would have produced dozens of jars of beer. The rodent problem is so severe that historians still argue whether it might have influenced the development of Egyptian religious beliefs, with some scholars suggesting that cats' later deification was rooted in very practical economic concerns rather than purely spiritual ones. The economic impact was staggering. By some estimates, ancient civilizations lost between 10–30% of stored grain to rodents and other pests. For Egypt, with its massive granaries supplying thousands of workers, this represented an existential threat to both their food security and their cultural cornerstone, beer production. For years, Egyptians employed human grain guardians who would patrol storehouses at night with sticks and torches, attempting to frighten away the rodents. But this was an inefficient use of human labor, and the clever rodents simply adapted their feeding times. Something more effective was needed, something that could hunt in the dark, move silently, and strike fear into the hearts of mice and rats. The solution would come from an unexpected source: small, self-sufficient predators that had lived in the deserts surrounding Egypt for thousands of years. These creatures would transform from wild hunters to domestic allies, creating one of the most successful interspecies partnerships in human history. And it would all revolve around protecting the precious ingredients that went into Egypt's most beloved beverage. You're crouching at the edge of a village near the Nile Delta, around 4,000 years ago. The moon casts silver light across mud brick homes and small garden plots. Your attention is drawn to a flicker of movement, a small, lithe shape slinking along the border between civilization and wilderness. It's an African wildcat, not quite the domestic tabby you're familiar with, but recognizably feline, muscular, alert, with distinctive markings that help it blend into the desert landscape. This is Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, and you're witnessing one of history's most consequential first dates between species. These natural predators had begun venturing closer to human settlements, drawn by an abundance of rodents feasting on grain stores. For wildcats, Egyptian villages were all-you-can-eat buffets, just waiting to be exploited. What makes this moment revolutionary is that neither humans nor cats had planned this relationship. You watch as villagers begin to notice something remarkable. Grain stores, visited by these feline hunters, suffered significantly less rodent damage. Early Egyptians were practical people. When they recognized a beneficial pattern, they encouraged it. At first, the relationship was one of mutual tolerance rather than domestication. Unlike dogs, which had been domesticated thousands of years earlier through deliberate human effort, cats essentially domesticated themselves. You can see villagers cautiously placing small bowls of milk or fish scraps near their granaries, not trying to make pets of these semi-wild hunters, but strategically encouraging them to stick around. The wildcats, for their part, found this arrangement perfectly acceptable. Why exhaust yourself hunting in the harsh desert when humans will attract rodents and occasionally provide bonus treats? It was, as modern corporate types might say, a win-win situation with excellent synergistic outcomes. Though I doubt ancient Egyptians used such insufferable terminology. One particularly amusing aspect of this early relationship, which historians rarely mention, is how cats must have initially terrified the local children. Imagine being a 6-year-old Egyptian kid, and suddenly these predators are hanging around the village, receiving preferential treatment from adults, and everyone acts like this is completely normal. There must have been some interesting bedtime conversations. Within a few generations, something remarkable happened. The wildcats most comfortable around humans were the ones that stayed, bred, and passed on their more docile traits. You're now observing cats that look subtly different, slightly smaller, with more varied coat patterns, and a notably increased tolerance for human presence. Genetic studies actually show that domestic cats have slightly smaller adrenal glands than their wild ancestors, making them literally less high-strung. The relationship between cats and breweries developed with particular intensity. Brewing facilities, with their large grain stores and the sweet scent of fermenting beer attracting rodents in droves, became perfect deployment zones for these efficient hunters. You watch as brewers begin to recognize individual cats, noting which ones were particularly effective at controlling the rodent population. Historians still argue whether cats were initially brought into Egyptian homes primarily as pest control or companions. The archaeological evidence suggests practical concerns came first, with the emotional bond developing later. But what's certain is that the economic benefit was immediately obvious. A family with a resident cat lost significantly less of their precious food and brewing supplies to rodents. These early brewery cats developed specialized skills that made them particularly valuable. They learned to patrol the specific areas where grain was stored and processed. Some would perch atop tall storage containers for hours, waiting patiently for any rodent foolish enough to attempt access. The brewers, recognizing this specialized behavior, began selectively encouraging cats that showed the most dedicated guarding instincts. What started as a casual relationship of convenience was rapidly evolving into something far more structured and intentional. The economic advantages were so clear that more formal arrangements began to develop. And soon, these useful mousers would catch the attention of Egypt's elite, elevating their status from helpful village predators to officially recognized protectors of one of Egypt's most valuable commodities, its beer. You're now standing in the shadow of a massive royal brewing complex attached to the Temple of Amun at Karnak, around 1400 BCE. The scale is industrial. Dozens of workers move purposefully between specialized stations, while supervisors with papyrus scrolls track every jar of beer produced. This isn't casual village brewing. This is a state-run operation, producing thousands of liters of beer daily for religious offerings, palace consumption, and payment to high-ranking officials. The investment in these facilities is staggering. Massive grain silos tower nearby, containing enough barley to brew beer for months. Clay jars line the walls, each capable of fermenting enough beer for 100 servings. Every aspect of production has been refined through centuries of experience. And guarding this valuable operation is an elite force of specialized protectors, cats, that have been selectively bred and trained specifically for brewery duty. You notice immediately that these are not ordinary village mousers. The brewery cats are sleek, attentive, and display distinctive collars, thin bands of colored cord that mark them as official royal employees. Yes, these cats are actually on Pharaoh's payroll, in a manner of speaking. Records from the period show that temple and royal brewery cats received regular rations of milk, fish, and choice bits of meat, officially allocated in the same administrative documents that recorded grain distributions and worker payments. The royal brewmaster approaches a particularly regal-looking gray cat perched atop a grain container. He addresses it with a formal title before offering a small morsel from his hand. This interaction reveals something fascinating about Egyptian beer cats. They occupied a strange dual status as both working animals and semi-divine beings. Their practical function was never separated from their spiritual significance. What's particularly amusing is that ancient Egyptian artwork never shows cats actually hunting mice in breweries. They're always depicted in dignified seated positions, as though the mere presence of these feline guardians was enough to ward off rodents. This is obviously ancient spin doctoring at work. Real brewery cats would have been active hunters, though they did spend plenty of time in that classic cat position we all know, sitting perfectly still while judging everyone around them harshly. Pharaoh Thutmose III was reportedly so impressed by the effectiveness of brewery cats that he ordered their implementation throughout all royal food production facilities. Ancient records suggest his breweries increased output by nearly 15% after implementing a formal cat guard program. Though, as with many ancient statistics, historians still argue about the accuracy of these figures and how much was royal propaganda. Strategic deployment of cats within these massive brewing operations reveals sophisticated understanding of feline behavior. You observe specialized sleeping niches built into walls near grain storage areas, perfect surveillance points, allowing cats to rest while remaining vigilant. The brewers have recognized that cats are naturally crepuscular hunters, most active at dawn and dusk when rodents typically feed, and have structured their operations to maximize this natural pattern. Unlike dogs, which were explicitly trained through human direction, brewery cats required a different management approach. Brewers created environments that encouraged natural hunting behaviors while minimizing interference with production. You notice elevated walkways connecting different areas of the brewery, dedicated cat paths that allowed the guardians to move quickly throughout the facility without disrupting workers or getting underfoot. One particularly quirky aspect of royal brewery cats was their diet management. While they received official rations, brewers carefully avoided overfeeding them. A hungry cat is a motivated hunter, after all. This led to the somewhat counterintuitive practice of better feeding cats during brewing downtime and slightly reducing rations during peak production periods when rodent control was most critical. As you continue observing the royal brewery, you notice something remarkable about how the human workers interact with the cats. There's genuine respect in their behavior. These aren't mere pets or tools, but valued colleagues in the brewing enterprise. When a brewer spots a cat successfully catching a mouse, he makes a small gesture of acknowledgement, a ritualized thank you that reinforces the partnership. This elevation of brewery cats from useful animals to officially recognized economic assets represents a pivotal evolution in the human-cat relationship. What began as a casual arrangement in village granaries has, under royal patronage, transformed into something far more structured and significant. And this formalization would lead to increasingly sophisticated methods for selecting, training, and deploying the perfect beer guardians. You're sitting cross-legged in the corner of a busy brewery training yard, watching as an elderly Egyptian man with sun-weathered skin works methodically with a group of young cats. The year is approximately 1200 BCE, and you're witnessing something remarkable, a formal training program for brewery guardian cats that's been refined over generations. the first thing that strikes you is that this isn't training as we think of it in modern terms. There are no treats, clickers, or commands being taught. Instead, the trainer, let's call him a menhodop, a common name meaning Amen is satisfied, is creating controlled scenarios that allow the cats to express and refine their natural hunting instincts. This one shows promise, a menhodop murmurs to his apprentice, nodding toward a sleek, attentive tabby kitten that has remained perfectly still for nearly 10 minutes, eyes fixed on a small gap between storage jars where brewery mice frequently emerge. What makes a good brewery cat isn't aggression or even hunting skill alone, but patience, the ability to remain vigilant for hours at strategic locations. The training process begins when kittens are just 8 weeks old. You watch as a menhodop places a new litter in a special enclosure containing a variety of surfaces, hiding spots, and yes, controlled populations of mice. This environment serves as a feline assessment center, allowing the trainers to identify which kittens display the most promising guarding behaviors. Contrary to what you might expect, the most aggressive hunters weren't always selected for brewery duty. A menhodop points out a particularly ferocious kitten that has caught 3 mice in quick succession. Too eager, he explains. This one will chase into places he shouldn't, knocking over jars and contaminating the beer. The ideal brewery cat was methodical, territorial, and most importantly, clean in its habits. One particularly amusing aspect of cat training involved what we might call staged rodent theater. Trainers would create miniature reconstructions of brewery environments, complete with tiny grain storage areas and fermentation zones. They would then release mice into these setups to observe which cats could catch pests without disturbing the mock brewing equipment. Imagine ancient Egyptian focus groups, but for cats. It's both ridiculous and surprisingly sophisticated. Historians still argue whether formal training documents existed for brewery cats, similar to those found for other specialized Egyptian occupations. Some fragmentary papyri contain what appears to be observations on feline hunting patterns, but whether this constituted an actual brewery cat manual remains controversial. What's clear is that knowledge was carefully passed down through generations of trainers. You observe an interesting ritual as a menhodop introduces young cats to the actual brewery environment for the first time. He carries each kitten through the facility, following a specific path, allowing it to absorb the scents and sounds of the operation. At key locations, grain storage, malting floors, fermentation areas, he places the kitten down briefly, letting it establish these spots in its mental territory map. Modern cat behaviorists would recognize this as a sophisticated understanding of how cats establish hunting territories. The most effective brewery cats underwent approximately 3 months of this specialized environmental familiarization before being considered fully deployed. Even then, cats were typically paired with an experienced older cat for another month, learning the specific routes and behaviors through observation. You're essentially watching an ancient Egyptian apprenticeship program, just for feline brewery guardians. One of the quirkier aspects of this training process was the graduation ceremony, when a cat was officially assigned to brewery duty. The cat would receive its distinctive colored collar, and the head brewer would formally welcome it into service with a small offering of milk mixed with a drop of beer. This might sound like I'm making it up, but ceremonial recognition of working animals was absolutely part of Egyptian cultural practice. Not all cats made the cut for royal brewery service. Those showing less aptitude for controlled hunting environments were redirected to household pest control, field duty, protecting grain crops, or general village mousing. This created something of a feline career hierarchy, with brewery positions being the most prestigious and well compensated with better food and accommodations. What makes this ancient training system remarkable is how it worked with, rather than against, natural feline instincts. Modern animal behaviorists would recognize this as positive selective reinforcement, creating environments where desired behaviors naturally occur, then rewarding those behaviors. The Egyptians had intuitively developed training methods that wouldn't be formally understood in scientific terms until thousands of years later. As the training session concludes, Amenhotep selects 3 kittens that have shown the most promise. They'll proceed to advanced training and eventually join the elite ranks of brewery guardian cats. This careful selection and training process ensured that the symbiotic relationship between cats and brewers continued to evolve and strengthen, setting the stage for an even deeper connection between these 2 species. You're leaning against a cool mud brick wall in the shade of a medium-sized brewery in Thebes around 1100 BCE. The afternoon sun beats down mercilessly outside, but in here, the thick walls keep the temperature stable, perfect for both beer fermentation and for the dozen or so cats lounging strategically throughout the facility. What you're witnessing now is a relationship that has evolved well beyond simple pest control into something far more complex and mutually beneficial. The brewery cats no longer merely hunt mice. They've become integrated into nearly every aspect of the operation. You notice a large ginger tom perched atop a grain storage bin, whiskers twitching occasionally as he surveys his domain. Nearby, a brewer measures out barley for the day's batch, seemingly oblivious to the cat's presence. But this apparent indifference masks a deep interdependence that has transformed both species. For the cats, the benefits of this arrangement were substantial. They received regular meals, safe shelter, and the satisfaction of their hunting instincts in a target-rich environment. But perhaps most significantly, they gained consistent human contact during their developmental periods, accelerating the domestication process with each generation. The kittens born in breweries would be increasingly comfortable with humans, more responsive to interaction, and better adapted to life alongside people. The brewers, meanwhile, gained far more than just rodent control. You observe a worker accidentally knock over a small container of grain. Before he can react, 3 nearby cats are already alert, watching to ensure no opportunistic mice emerge to steal the spilled treasure. The cats have become a living security system, their mere presence deterring rodents from even attempting to to access the precious brewing ingredients. What's particularly fascinating is how the cats have adapted behaviorally to the brewing environment. You notice they've established clear territories within the facility. The grain storage, cats rarely venture near the fermentation area, while the malt floor has its own dedicated feline guardians. This natural territoriality has been incorporated into the brewery's pest defense strategy, ensuring complete coverage without human management. The relationship has yielded some unexpected benefits too. The brewery's reputation for exceptionally clean beer is partially due to its impressive feline staff. Because rats and mice avoid areas with high cat populations, there's significantly less contamination in both ingredients and finished product. In an age before germ theory, this produced noticeably better beer, even if the brewers didn't fully understand why. One particularly amusing aspect of brewery life is the development of what we might call cat-human communication protocols. You watch as the head brewer notices a calico cat staring intently at a small crack in the wall. Without any obvious signal, he immediately retrieves tools and begins repairing the potential entry point. The cats have learned to alert humans to vulnerabilities in the brewery's rodent defenses, while humans have learned to read these subtle feline signals. Historians still argue about whether cats actually affected the architectural development of Egyptian breweries. Some archaeological evidence suggests storage areas were increasingly designed with elevated platforms and clear sightlines, perfect for feline surveillance. Was this intentional cat-friendly design, or just practical brewing evolution? The debate continues, though the cats seem quite comfortable regardless. Mutual benefits extended to health aspects as well. Breweries with established cat populations had significantly lower instances of grain-borne illnesses, as the reduced rodent presence meant less contamination from rat-spread diseases. The Egyptians couldn't have understood the microbiology involved, but they certainly observed the correlation between healthy cats and healthy brewers. As you continue observing the brewery, you notice something that truly demonstrates how integrated the cats have become there, actually influencing the daily rhythm of operations. The brewer's time certain activities around periods when the cats are most active, maximizing protection during vulnerable processes like grain transfers or moving dried malt. The production schedule has subtly adapted to feline hunting patterns. This symbiotic relationship had profound long-term implications for both species. For cats, it accelerated their evolution from wild hunters to domestic companions, selecting for traits that made them better brewery partners: attentiveness, territorial behavior, and tolerance of human activity. For the brewing industry, it created a sustainable pest management system that would help establish Egyptian beer as one of the ancient world's most reliable and celebrated beverages. The cats protect the beer feeds the people protect the cats, a brewer explains to his apprentice, succinctly summing up this three-way relationship. This wasn't just an economic arrangement, but an early example of what we might now call a sustainable ecosystem, a balance between human production, animal behavior, and pest management that benefited all parties involved, except, of course, the mice. As the brewery begins winding down its daily operations, you notice the cats becoming more active, preparing for their evening patrols. The partnership you've witnessed has moved well beyond its practical origins, setting the stage for an even more significant development: the transformation of these useful brewery guardians into something approaching divine status in Egyptian culture. You're standing in the crowded forecourt of a temple dedicated to Bastet in the city of Bubastes, around 950 BCE. The air is thick with incense, and thousands of pilgrims have gathered for the annual festival honoring the cat-headed goddess. What started as a practical partnership between brewers and feline rodent hunters has, over centuries, evolved into something far more profound: a religious veneration that would make cats among the most sacred animals in Egyptian culture. The connection between brewery cats and divine status wasn't immediate or straightforward. You can see this evolution reflected in the temple artwork surrounding you. Earlier depictions show cats in clearly utilitarian roles, hunting mice near grain stores or prowling brewery floors. But more recent imagery portrays cats with increasing reverence, sometimes with solar discs above their heads or elaborate jewelry adorning their forms. The transformation from useful employee to divine representative was gradual but unmistakable. Bastet herself underwent a similar evolution. In earlier periods, she was depicted as a fierce lioness, a protector goddess associated with warfare. But as domestic cats became increasingly integrated into Egyptian daily life, particularly through their brewery connections, Bastet's imagery softened. She became the familiar cat-headed woman, associated with home, fertility, and protection of the food supply, including, crucially, beer production. The logical connection is clear when you think about it. Cats protected grain, grain became beer. Beer was considered divine sustenance, with its own patron deities. It's a small step from valuable economic contributor to divine agent, ensuring the flow of sacred beverages. The fact that cats were particularly associated with breweries, centers of production for what Egyptians considered a divine gift, accelerated their religious significance. One particularly quirky aspect of this religious evolution was the development of cat-themed brewing vessels. You notice pilgrims purchasing small cat-shaped containers designed to hold ceremonial beer offerings. These vessels, with pouring spouts often formed by the cat's mouth or tail, physically embodied the connection between felines and fermentation. Historians still argue about whether these were primarily ritual objects or actually used in regular beer consumption, possibly both. Knowing how Egyptians blended the practical and spiritual, the brewery temple connection grew particularly strong during this period. Many temples maintained their own brewing facilities to produce beer for offerings and ritual consumption, and these temple breweries became showcases for the most elaborate cat integration. The brewery cats in these sacred spaces received special training, distinctive ornamentation, and ceremonial food, effectively functioning as living symbols of divine protection over the brewing process. This elevated status created some rather amusing situations. There are records of brewery cats being given titles similar to human priests, receiving their own dedicated attendants, and even being included in brewery inventories as assets more valuable than the equipment itself. Imagine being the junior brewer whose job description included deputy assistant to the divine feline overseer. Yes, that was somebody's actual job. What makes this religious transformation especially interesting is how it reinforced and expanded the practical benefits of cats in breweries. Once cats gained sacred status, harming them became not just economically foolish, but religiously dangerous. This added an extra layer of protection for the brewery's feline staff, ensuring they could perform their rodent control duties without interference. You observe a brewer making a small offering at a cat shrine situated directly within the brewing facility. This wasn't mere superstition, but a practical acknowledgement of the cat's contribution to brewing success. The religious practices surrounding brewery cats served as an early form of quality assurance. By honoring the cats, brewers were essentially committing to maintaining the clean, rodent-free environments that produced superior beer. Historians still argue about exactly when and why cats achieved their extreme level of veneration in Egypt, but the brewery connection provides a compelling economic foundation for their religious elevation. Protecting the grain supply wasn't just a practical concern, but an existential one for Egyptian society, and the cat's role in this protection naturally took on cosmic significance. The religious significance had measurable impacts on cat welfare and breeding. Temple and brewery cats were often selectively bred for specific traits, color patterns associated with certain deities, physical characteristics believed to indicate divine favor. You're watching the early stages of deliberate feline husbandry, driven by a blend of religious reverence and practical brewing considerations. As the religious ceremony reaches its climax, you notice something remarkable. The high priest raises a ceremonial vessel of beer, while beside him sits a magnificently adorned cat, seemingly overseeing the proceedings with typical feline indifference. This image perfectly captures the extraordinary journey of the brewery cat, from useful hunter to divine representative, all while continuing to perform its original practical function. This religious elevation would have profound implications, not just for Egyptian brewing, but for the global spread of domestic cats. The sacred status of brewery cats would help ensure their protection and careful breeding, preserving the domestication process that had begun with those first wildcats hunting mice in village grain stores. And soon, these divine mousers would begin traveling beyond Egypt's borders, carrying their brewing associations with them. You're standing on the weathered wooden deck of a Phoenician trading vessel making its way across the Mediterranean around 900 BCE. The ship is laden with valuable Egyptian goods, papyrus, linen, jewelry, and dozens of sealed amphorae containing the kingdom's famous beer. But the cargo manifest includes another, less official Egyptian export: 3 sleek cats prowling between the rows of merchandise, ostensibly brought aboard to protect the goods from rats, but destined to change the course of feline history far beyond Egypt's borders. The international beer trade became one of the primary vectors for the spread of domestic cats throughout the ancient world. Egyptian beer was renowned for its quality and consistency, attributes directly linked to their sophisticated cat-based rodent control systems. As demand for this prestigious beverage grew across the Mediterranean and beyond, the cats that protected it became valuable exports themselves. You watch as the ship's captain carefully explains to a new crew member how to care for the feline passengers. These aren't just any cats, they're trained brewery guardians, accompanying the beer to ensure it arrives in pristine condition. The instructions are detailed: specific foods, preferred resting areas, and a warning not to disturb them while they're hunting. These cats are treated more like specialized crew members than animals working professionals on an international assignment. What's particularly fascinating is how the reputation of Egyptian brewery cats preceded them. Port authorities in Crete, Cyprus, and Greece had begun specifically requesting that Egyptian beer shipments include at least one cat. They had learned that vessels arriving with feline guardians suffered significantly less spoilage during transit. In an age before refrigeration and modern preservatives, this feline quality control made a substantial economic difference. The cats, for their part, adapted remarkably well to seafaring life. The confined space of a ship with abundant rodent prey suited their hunting instincts perfectly. You notice how the three cats have already established territories aboard the vessel, one monitoring the main cargo hold, another patrolling the crew quarters, and the third keeping watch over the galley stores. This natural territoriality made them ideal shipping companions, creating layered protection throughout the vessel. One particularly amusing aspect of the maritime cat trade was the development of what modern economists would call value-added bundling. Merchants realized that beer shipped with its feline protector commanded a premium price compared to unaccompanied beverages. The cats were effectively serving as living quality guarantees, their presence assuring buyers that the beer had been properly protected throughout its journey. Historians still argue about whether cats were intentionally exported as part of Egyptian trade policy or simply traveled as unofficial brewing assistants. Evidence suggests both occurred. Some cats were formal diplomatic gifts or trade goods, while others were working animals that decided to relocate after reaching foreign ports. A cat, after all, will ultimately go wherever it pleases, a fact ancient sailors understood as well as we do today. The global spread had unforeseen consequences for brewing practices throughout the Mediterranean. As Egyptian cats established themselves in new territories, local brewers quickly recognized their value. You can picture the scene in a Greek port town. A local brewer watches in amazement as an Egyptian cat eliminates the persistent rodent problem that had plagued his operation for years. Within a generation, cats had become standard features in brewing facilities throughout the region. This feline diaspora accelerated when Romans began incorporating cats into their own food production and storage systems. What had begun as a specifically Egyptian brewing practice evolved into a Mediterranean-wide standard for food safety. The Romans, practical as always, didn't necessarily adopt the religious reverence for cats, but they certainly appreciated their economic benefits. As you follow the journey of these seafaring brewery cats, you witness something remarkable: the adaptive radiation of cat behaviors. In new environments with different brewing practices, the cats adjusted their protective strategies accordingly. Greek brewery cats became adept at guarding the distinctive pitched storage amphorae, while Persian cats developed techniques for monitoring the different grains used in Eastern brewing traditions. The spread of brewery cats created another interesting phenomenon: an early form of selective breeding across different regions. Local preferences and brewing needs influenced which cat traits were favored. In cooler northern regions, cats with thicker coats were preferred for brewery duty, as they could maintain their protective patrols even in colder storage areas. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern brewers selected for cats with particular heat tolerance. This regional selection contributed to the diverse cat breeds we know today. As the ship approaches its destination, you reflect on the extraordinary journey of these feline brewing assistants, from the banks of the Nile to the far corners of the ancient world. What began as a practical solution to Egypt's brewing problems had grown into an international phenomenon, carried along the trading routes by the very beverage they were originally tasked with protecting. You're standing in the outer chamber of an Egyptian magistrate's court in Thebes, around 800 BCE. The room buzzes with tense conversation as a serious case is about to be heard. A brewery worker stands accused of harming one of the facility's guardian cats. The charged atmosphere reflects the gravity of this offense, which is not merely a property crime, but a transgression with religious, economic, and legal dimensions. The legal protection of brewery cats represents one of history's earliest examples of formalized animal welfare laws. You're watching as the magistrate enters, followed by a scribe carrying papyrus scrolls containing the relevant legal codes. These aren't general pronouncements about being kind to animals. They're specific, detailed regulations regarding the treatment of cats, with particularly stringent protections for those serving in economic roles like brewery guardians. The defendant looks appropriately terrified, and with good reason. Penalties for harming a cat in ancient Egypt were severe, ranging from heavy fines to physical punishment. For brewery cats specifically, the consequences could be even more dramatic, as they were considered both economic assets and religious entities. Depending on the severity of the offense and the status of the particular cat, punishment could include compensation to the brewery, mandatory offerings to Bastet, and in extreme cases, execution. What makes this legal framework particularly remarkable was its sophistication. The laws distinguished between different types of offenses against cats: accidental injury, neglect, or intentional harm, with corresponding gradations of punishment. They also recognized different categories of cats, with brewery and temple cats receiving the highest level of protection. You're essentially witnessing an early form of occupational safety law, just for felines. The trial proceedings begin, and you listen as witnesses describe the incident. Apparently, the accused had attempted to chase away a brewery cat that was sleeping near a preparation area. In his haste to clear the space, he had struck the cat with a reed broom, causing minor injury. What might seem like a trivial offense to modern sensibilities was, in this context, a serious crime with multiple dimensions of harm. One particularly amusing aspect of these legal protections was the development of what we might call cat alibis. Brewery workers developed elaborate systems for documenting their locations and activities, specifically to protect themselves from accusations of cat-related misconduct. Imagine needing a signed affidavit confirming you were nowhere near the malting floor when Whiskers mysteriously lost some fur. This was legitimately a concern for ancient Egyptian brewery employees. Historians still argue about whether these strict legal protections were primarily religiously motivated or economically pragmatic. The evidence suggests both factors were intertwined. Protecting cats served both divine and practical brewing interests simultaneously. The genius of the Egyptian approach was recognizing that these motivations could reinforce rather than contradict each other. The protection extended beyond active harm to include requirements for proper care. Breweries were legally obligated to provide appropriate food, water, and shelter for their feline staff. Regular inspections could be conducted by temple officials to ensure compliance, with fines levied against operations that failed to properly maintain their cat guardians. You're seeing an early regulatory framework that wouldn't look entirely unfamiliar to modern workplace safety inspectors, just with a decidedly more feline focus. What's particularly fascinating is how these legal protections influenced architectural developments in breweries. You notice specialized features incorporated into the brewery design: elevated pathways for cat movement, protected sleeping areas, and carefully planned escape routes, ensuring cats could always retreat from human activity if desired. These weren't merely conveniences, but legal requirements, mandated to ensure feline guardians could perform their duties without endangering themselves. The case before the court takes an interesting turn when the brewery's master brewer testifies. Rather than demanding maximum punishment, he requests leniency, noting that the worker has been otherwise exemplary, and the cat in question has already returned to its duties without apparent trauma. This reflects another nuance of the legal system. It recognized that maintaining brewing operations required balancing strict cat protection with practical human concerns. Legal documents from the period reveal another interesting development: the inclusion of cats in brewery inheritance and transfer agreements. When a brewing operation changed ownership, the resident cats were specifically enumerated in the contract, with stipulations regarding their continued care and protection. These weren't just assets being transferred, but specialized workers with legal rights that persisted regardless of human ownership changes. As the magistrate renders his verdict, a substantial fine plus mandatory offerings to Bastet, but no physical punishment, you reflect on the extraordinary legal status these brewery guardians had achieved. From simple mousers to legally protected employees with specific rights and protections, their evolution perfectly encapsulates the unique relationship between cats, beer, and Egyptian society. This legal framework would have long-lasting implications, establishing precedents for animal protection that would influence cultures throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. And as significant changes began to impact Egyptian society and its brewing traditions, these legal protections would help ensure that the cat-brewery relationship remained resilient even in the face of environmental and political catastrophes. You're trudging through a parched landscape along the Nile around 750 BCE, witnessing the devastating effects of an extended drought that has plagued Egypt for nearly a decade. The mighty river has failed to flood adequately for several consecutive years. Agricultural yields have plummeted, and the kingdom's brewing industry, so dependent on abundant grain, faces an existential crisis. Yet amid this catastrophe, you're about to witness remarkable innovations in both brewing methods and feline deployment. The first adaptation you notice is a fundamental shift in brewery design. Traditional open-air facilities have been modified with covered work areas and additional shade structures. These aren't just for human comfort. They create cooler microclimates where precious grain can be stored with less spoilage in the intensified heat. The cats, already heat-adapted as desert creatures, patrol these new spaces with their customary efficiency, though you notice they're more active during the cooler morning and evening hours. Grain shortages forced Egyptian brewers to experiment with alternative ingredients. Dates, pomegranates, and other fruits were increasingly incorporated into beer recipes. This created new challenges for the brewery cats. Different ingredients attracted different pests, requiring adaptations in hunting behaviors. You watch as brewery supervisors intentionally rotate cats between storage areas, exposing them to various ingredients and the pests they attract, essentially creating specialized teams of guardian cats with expertise in protecting specific brewing components. One particularly ingenious innovation emerged in response to increased rodent pressure on limited grain supplies. Brewers began creating what we might call strategic cat deployment maps, carefully planned schedules ensuring that the most valuable or vulnerable ingredients received the highest concentration of feline protection. This wasn't just about having cats present, but optimizing their protective impact through sophisticated rotation and territory management. The environmental stress had another fascinating effect. It accelerated selective breeding of brewery cats. With resources limited and protection more critical than ever, brewers became increasingly selective about which cats they maintained. Those demonstrating exceptional heat tolerance, minimal water requirements, and most importantly, unwavering hunting focus despite environmental stressors were preferentially bred. This crisis period effectively created a more specialized, efficient brewery cat, adapted specifically for protecting precious resources during scarcity. Historians still argue about whether this period of environmental catastrophe actually strengthened the cat-brewery relationship rather than weakening it. The evidence suggests that shared adversity created stronger bonds. Cats and brewers literally depended on each other for survival during these lean years. Some scholars have even suggested that the extreme veneration of cats in later Egyptian periods was partially rooted in collective memory of how these feline guardians helped preserve brewing traditions through environmental crises. What's particularly amusing about this period is the development of what we might call cat-centric brewing superstitions. With resources scarce and success uncertain, brewers became increasingly attentive to feline behavior as potential omens. If the brewery cats appeared restless or hunted with unusual intensity, brewers might delay grain processing, believing the cats were signaling an imminent rodent threat. These weren't just quaint beliefs. They often had practical benefits, aligning brewing activities with actual pest pressure cycles. The catastrophic conditions forced innovation in cat care as well. With fish and meat less available, brewery cats received carefully formulated diets supplemented with protein-rich brewing byproducts. You observe a brewery worker preparing a special mixture of spent grain and small amounts of brewer's yeast, nutrients that would otherwise be wasted, but could help maintain the strength of these essential guardians during food shortages. Environmental crisis coincided with political instability, creating additional challenges for brewing operations. You notice increased security measures around surviving breweries, not just to protect against human thieves, but to prevent desperate citizens from abducting the valuable brewery cats themselves. A skilled brewing cat had become such a valuable asset that they were sometimes targeted for theft, requiring protective measures that would have been unnecessary in more prosperous times. What emerges most clearly from this period of catastrophe is the remarkable resilience of the cat-brewery partnership. Rather than abandoning their feline protectors as an unaffordable luxury during hard times, Egyptian brewers doubled down on the relationship, recognizing that efficient pest control was even more critical when every grain kernel represented significant value. This counterintuitive investment in feline guardians during resource scarcity helped preserve brewing knowledge and cat husbandry techniques that might otherwise have been lost. As rain finally returns to the Nile Valley and the environmental crisis gradually subsides, you notice something interesting. The innovations developed during scarcity don't disappear. The more efficient cat deployment strategies, specialized breeding approaches, and adaptive brewing techniques become permanent features of Egyptian beer production. Crisis had served as a catalyst for refinement, creating more sophisticated integration between cats and brewing than had existed before the catastrophe. This pattern of adaptation and innovation in the face of challenges would continue throughout the remaining history of ancient Egyptian brewing. And as you'll soon discover, the evidence of this remarkable partnership between cats and beer makers wouldn't be lost to history, but preserved in fascinating archaeological discoveries that continue to to illuminate this unique interspecies collaboration. You're standing in a climate-controlled laboratory at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, watching as an archaeological team carefully examines their latest discovery, the remains of a brewery complex from approximately 600 BCE, complete with compelling evidence of its feline guardians. The sterile, modern environment couldn't be more different from the bustling, grain-scented facilities you've been exploring. But here, you'll witness how modern science is piecing together the remarkable story of Egypt's brewery cats. The first evidence spreads across the examination table, delicate feline skeletal remains discovered in special chambers attached to the brewery's grain storage areas. These aren't random cat burials, but carefully prepared interments, complete with small offering bowls, and in several cases, miniature beer vessels. The archaeologists point out the distinctive positioning. The cats were arranged in seated postures, eternally vigilant, continuing their protective role even in death. What makes these discoveries particularly valuable is their contextual integrity. Unlike many ancient Egyptian cat remains, which were often collected in mass religious burials, these brewery cats were interred in their actual working locations. This allows archaeologists to reconstruct specific aspects of their deployment and usage within brewing operations. The positioning of cat remains in relation to grain storage, processing areas, and fermentation zones, reveals sophisticated strategic placement of these feline guardians. One particularly fascinating discovery from this site is a partial papyrus that appears to be a brewery inventory. Listed alongside quantities of grain, beer vessels, and brewing tools are specific entries for cats, identified by name and apparent specialization. Miut, guardian of the eastern granary, offspring of Neferet, reads one entry, suggesting a tracking system that included not just numbers, but lineages and specific duties. This represents some of the earliest documented evidence of working animal record keeping. The skeletal evidence itself tells remarkable stories. Careful examination reveals that brewery cats typically lived longer than their village counterparts, suggesting better nutrition and care. However, they also show distinctive skeletal adaptations, particularly developed shoulder muscles, and specific wear patterns on teeth consistent with regular hunting of small prey. These were not pampered pets, but working animals whose bodies reflected their specialized occupation. Historians still argue about the interpretation of certain archaeological findings, particularly regarding religious versus practical motivations. Some cat burials include stylized brewing scenes in their decoration. But do these represent an actual belief that cats would continue guarding beer in the afterlife, or simply acknowledge their earthly profession? The debate continues, though most scholars now recognize that practical and religious aspects were likely inseparable in ancient Egyptian thinking. One of the quirkier archaeological discoveries comes from residue analysis of ancient brewing vessels. Using sophisticated chemical techniques, researchers have identified trace amounts of feline hair in approximately 23% of examined beer containers. far from indicating contamination. This suggests cats were so integrated into the brewing environment that their presence literally became part of the product, a finding that would horrify modern food safety inspectors, but seems to have been entirely acceptable to ancient Egyptian beer drinkers. What's particularly amusing about modern archaeological approaches is how they sometimes unintentionally recreate ancient conditions. You notice the laboratory has its own resident cat, officially there to control mice that might damage delicate organic remains, but unmistakably echoing the very relationship being studied. The archaeologists have affectionately named her Tenenet, after an ancient Egyptian beer goddess, creating a living link to the tradition they're researching. The archaeological record reveals another fascinating aspect of brewery cats, their apparent status as brewing omens or predictors. Several discovered breweries contain small shrines featuring cat imagery alongside symbols associated with Nile flooding, suggesting brewers may have observed cat behavior as indicators of coming agricultural conditions. This blending of practical observation with religious interpretation perfectly encapsulates the complex role these animals played. Material evidence confirms the international spread of brewery cats as well. Cat remains with Egyptian mitochondrial DNA have been discovered at ancient brewing sites across the Mediterranean, confirming that Egyptian cats were indeed transported to protect beer production in other regions. These cats represent some of the earliest documented intentional animal introductions for economic purposes, a practice that would become common throughout human history. The archaeological evidence extends beyond physical remains to artistic representations. Brewery scenes depicted in tomb paintings frequently include cats in standardized positions, typically seated upright beside grain storage containers or watching over processing areas. The consistency of these depictions across centuries suggests formalized conventions for representing these working animals, reflecting their established and recognized role in brewing operations. As you watch the archaeological team continuing their meticulous documentation, you realize something profound. The evidence they're uncovering isn't just illuminating ancient brewing practices, but documenting one of history's most successful interspecies partnerships. The relationship between cats and brewers, far from being a historical footnote, represents a case study in mutually beneficial collaboration that would have lasting implications for both human industry and feline evolution. And as you'll discover next, this ancient partnership didn't simply vanish into historical obscurity, but continues to influence modern brewing culture in surprising and delightful ways, creating a living legacy from those first wildcats who discovered that Egyptian breweries offered premium hunting opportunities. You're walking through the cavernous space of a contemporary craft brewery in Portland, Oregon, where gleaming stainless steel tanks have replaced clay amphory, and computerized systems monitor fermentation that once required constant human attention. At first glance, this high-tech facility seems worlds away from the Egyptian breweries you've been exploring. But look closer, and you'll spot a sleek tortoiseshell cat perched atop a grain pallet, maintaining maintaining a tradition that stretches back over 5 millennia. The legacy of Egyptian brewery cats persists in surprisingly direct ways within modern brewing culture. Dozens of contemporary breweries around the world maintain resident cats, officially classified as working animals for pest control purposes to satisfy health regulations. These modern brewery cats may enjoy cushier accommodations than their ancient counterparts, but they perform essentially the same function, protecting valuable ingredients from rodents that still find breweries as attractive as they did in ancient times. What's particularly fascinating is how the tradition has been maintained despite massive technological changes in brewing. You watch as the brewery owner checks a digital security system that includes motion sensors in grain storage areas. Yet, she still values the cat's presence as an additional layer of protection. When asked about this seeming redundancy, she explains that even with modern technology, cats provide a deterrent effect that mechanical systems alone cannot replicate. The mere scent of a resident cat discourages rodents from establishing themselves in the facility. The historical connection isn't lost on modern brewers either. You notice the brewery's logo features a stylized Egyptian cat beside a beer vessel, and their flagship IPA is called Guardian's Reward. This deliberate invocation of brewing history represents more than cute marketing. It reflects a genuine appreciation for the role cats played in developing and protecting the brewing tradition these craftspeople are continuing. One particularly amusing modern parallel is the development of brewery cat social media accounts. The tortoiseshell guardian you've been watching has her own Instagram following, with thousands of fans tracking her brewery activities. These digital platforms serve a surprisingly similar function to the religious imagery of ancient Egypt. They elevate brewery cats beyond mere pest control to cultural icons, celebrating their role in brewing heritage. The cat doesn't understand her fame, of course, but she certainly enjoys the extra treats her celebrity status earns her. Historians still argue about whether the modern brewery cat tradition represents direct cultural transmission or convergent evolution. Did brewers maintain cats continuously since ancient times, or did they independently rediscover the benefits of feline guardians? The evidence suggests some of both, with the tradition never completely disappearing in certain regions, while being periodically rediscovered in others when brewers noticed how effectively cats controlled persistent rodent problems. The practical benefits remain as relevant as ever. Modern breweries report significantly lower contamination issues and ingredient loss when they maintain resident cats. One brewery owner estimates his grain loss decreased by nearly 30% after adopting 2 former shelter cats as brewery guardians. The ROI on cat maintenance, costs versus ingredient protection, creates the same compelling economic case that ancient Egyptians recognized thousands of years ago. Beyond working cats, the historical connection between brewing and felines has inspired numerous modern beer names and brands. Bastards Brew, Pharaoh's Feline, and Guardian IPA are just a few examples of contemporary beers that reference this ancient relationship. The imagery appears on tap handles, coasters, and merchandise, a living legacy of the original brewery guardians that continues to resonate with modern beer drinkers. What's particularly heartwarming is how this ancient tradition now intersects with animal welfare efforts. Several brewing associations have established working cats programs that place otherwise unadoptable shelter cats in breweries, where their natural hunting instincts become valuable skills rather than behavioral problems. These initiatives have saved thousands of cats while providing breweries with enthusiastic guardians, creating a contemporary version of the mutually beneficial relationship that began beside the Nile. As the craft brewing movement has embraced historical brewing techniques, some brewers have become amateur archaeologists themselves, attempting to recreate ancient Egyptian beer recipes. These experimental brews, often flavored with dates, honey, and herbs mentioned in ancient texts, are frequently named after or labeled with cat imagery, maintaining the connection between these historical brewing traditions and their feline protectors. As night falls and the brewery closes to visitors, you watch the tortoiseshell cat begin her evening patrol, moving systematically through the facility just as her ancestors did thousands of years ago. The brewing equipment may have changed dramatically, but the core relationship, a mutually beneficial partnership between brewers and feline guardians, remains remarkably consistent across millennia. The brewery cat tradition represents something profound in human history, a relationship that transcended mere utility to become culturally, economically, and even spiritually significant. From those first wildcats hunting mice in Egyptian grain stores to today's Instagram-famous brewery mascots, cats have been our constant companions in creating one of humanity's oldest and most beloved beverages. As our journey through this remarkable history comes to close, I hope you've enjoyed discovering how something as seemingly simple as cats keeping mice away from brewing ingredients could develop into such a rich and enduring tradition. The story of brewery cats reminds us that history isn't just about monuments and rulers, but about the everyday relationships that shaped human civilization in unexpected ways. Your eyelids are feeling heavy now, your breathing slowing down as you drift toward sleep. Perhaps you'll dream of ancient Egyptian breweries where sacred cats patrol between clay fermentation vessels under a brilliant desert moon. Or maybe you'll simply enjoy the deep restfulness that comes from knowing that some traditions, like brewing and our feline friends, have been comforting constants throughout human history. Either way, I hope you sleep well, and I'll be here with another bedtime history when you're ready for your next journey into the past. Good night.